Hey guys, this is Stéphane Wootha and welcome to this making of Down the Rabbit Hole. So, I didn't record the full process for this image, so what I'm going to do in this making of, I'm going to go through all the files I've recorded and all the different stages, and I will share with you the state of mind and the different thought process and techniques and all the technical stuff I can share about the making of this image. So, sim. I think in image making, having sims before starting to make an image is obviously essential, and this is something we are required to have in professional environment simply because we have a brief, and the brief already convey the sim. But when you are doing personal work, it might be tempting to just go for something we like to do and try to figure out a story as we go, and not being conscious about the sim we want to talk about. And I think most of the times it will probably work. But for myself, what I've been trying to do in this image, and what I try to do in many of my images right now, since a while, since maybe 1 year, is to have sim before starting to make the image, because having sims allow me to build a storytelling, or even more importantly, something I'll cover in the next lesson, to build up a potential for a deeper storytelling, which is going to change from one viewer to another. So this is why I refer it as a potential for storytelling and not necessarily an obvious storytelling. And having sim in the first place is very important, because this is on these sims that many things can build up after this. I think about this tool I've been building, and maybe I'll detail it in another tutorial. But basically, this stage here of symbolism is possible and can exist along with the storytelling, which is a drama, if we have a sim in the first place. At least it could exist without a sim, but when you have a sim, it's easier to start to build all these little elements that are going to refer to various stages of the sim. So let me explain what are the sims I wanted to cover in this image, so it can make sense. So the first sim was the initiatic experience, or the passage from one state of consciousness to another state of consciousness through an event or an aging or something that happened in your life that help you to move from one state to another. The second theme was in reference to the first one, the passage from childhood to grown-up. And the third theme was the theme of introspection, diving into your own subconscious, to your own inner representation and symbolism of the world, which is also something I wanted to cover, so introspection. And the fourth theme was something also I wanted to add in this image that is important for me, is the hypersexualization in modern society, and especially hypersexualization for young girls. So these are the four main themes I wanted to cover in this image, and all these themes, they help me afterward to build my storytelling and to build my symbols based on all these elements. After the themes come inspiration, because I believe that art is mainly a collective achievement. What I mean by that is, by building up art on top of other artists and putting yourself in the idea that you're not only creating something on your own, but you are creating something based on what has been done before you, and on using the achievement and the artworks and the art in general of other artists before you, then you're going to create something which is going to be stronger than if you were trying to build something on your own without any referencing on, without building up on top of the other artist. So inspiration really, for me, come to this. Try to find the artist that I really like, the artwork or the stories or the books and the movies that really inspire me, and try to build on top of this. So the inspiration for this image, there is three main inspirations. There is first, obviously, there is Alice in Wonderland, which is maybe the first thing. I don't know if it's the first thing, but something that is quite obvious with the presence of this white rabbit here and this girl falling down in something that really refer to a vortex or a hole. The second reference is a reference to Matrix, which is an inspiration here, which is very just a reference. It's something that is not present, that is not really present at the visual level, but it's still something that I've been using to build upon it, especially at the storytelling level. So there is this reference here of this girl trying to reach back to this blue pill after throwing down the red pill. So I will come into storytelling and semantic, not semantic, but symbolism in the next video. But right now, yeah. So there is this reference to the Matrix. And the third reference is the reference to the third inspiration is a children book which is named Where the Wild Things Are. So it has a different name depending on the country you are living in. In French, it's Max et les Maxi Monstres. It's really a great children book. I read it when I was myself a child, and I read it to my own children. And this monster, they are very inspired by the monster of Where the Wild Things Are. There is secondary references, obviously. I really like the world of Hayao Miyazaki. So there is, it's not really present here, but that's something I like to have in the back of my head when I'm making images. So color-wise, I really love like very colored things with very strong local colors. This is really what I wanted to have here, and also to reference kind of this 60-70 representation of what an initiatic introspection through products like LSD could be. I never tried it myself, but there is in popular culture this idea that when you are taking some kind of drugs, you can have an initiatic experience, and often these are represented with like these very crazy and strong local colors. But the challenge, and I'm going to talk about that later, the challenge with very strong and completely disparate local colors is to make them work together in a harmonious way. So it's been another thing I wanted to add in my image. And yeah, I think this is it for inspiration. Symbolism and storytelling. So I think images have this incredible power to set a potential for storytelling and for analysis. And I use the word potential because for me it's really something I really love in images that I find very interesting, is to not tell a story, but create the potential for the viewer to create his own story. And I think it's much more interesting because when you start to exactly tell what things are about and exactly give all the story to the viewer, then the viewer is going to look at the image, figure out the story, and he's going to move on, and it's done. You said your story. But when you are creating a potential for storytelling, then you are offering the possibility for your viewer to spend more time in the image trying to figure out what is happening. And I think it's much more interesting for me. I remember when I was a child, these images I was looking at where I couldn't really understand what was going on at first. So I had to spend time in this image to try to figure why the character had certain expression or what was they doing, you know. And then you start to really build all a world that is based on your own experience of the world. And the story you are going to come with in this very specific case for yourself might be completely different from the story that another person is going to make up with the same images, with the same image. So this is what I try to achieve in my image, and what I really try to achieve in this image, to create the potential for storytelling and for symbolism. So I'm going to go through my own story. But what could be interesting right now is that you pause the video and really try to build your story. And then you continue and you listen to my own story, and you see if we have the same interpretation. So there is several, for me, layer of storytelling. But the first, obviously, is this girl who is falling into this giant environment. And she tried to reach back to this blue pill, and she threw away the red one. So the red pill, as we know from the Matrix, is a symbol for accessing the unknown knowledge, for accessing to another level of understanding. And sometimes I think there is this moment in life, and especially when you are moving from childhood to grown up, where you don't want to go in the adult world, because all of a sudden you start to access, because you took the red pill, which is just growing up. You start to see the world from a different point of view, and it can start to become really scary. And as you are changing, and I think this is something that really happens for girls when they start to reach the adult age, and society start to really looking at her not now as a child but as a woman. And in the same way, some people can start to objective this person and start to see her as an object of desire instead of a person, especially with the internet and all the access we have to this imagery, and it can be really scary. So this is what I wanted to illustrate here. She already obviously took this red pill, because this environment she already is in her. But now she want to reach back to that blue pill. She want to go back to where she was before, like Cypher in Matrix. And this is its main idea. This dude here, these monsters, they can be several things for me. They can be the gentle monsters that you find in where the wild things are. You know, at the end, they can represent who own emotion, who own perception of the world, or they can represent, the grown-up. Some people that were at some point perceived as kind and gentle people, but when you start to reach to a certain level of awareness of the world that exists around you, and you start to perceive that maybe they have different intention toward yourself than what you were thinking in the first place. And all of a sudden, these smiles, they pass from a state of being gentle smiles of gentle monsters to maybe something completely different. Maybe this is, desire. Maybe this is different intention there is behind this monster. And it can be super scary to realize that the world is just more complicated than having gentle people and bad people. Here, this dude here, they are observing the scene. So they are a reference for in this society of high images we have everywhere. We tend to observe the world in a safe place, which is behind our screen. So we want to have this experience of immersing ourselves into imaginary worlds, into representation of the world that are more appealing than what we have in our day-to-day. But we still want to do it from the safety of a place where we are not completely involved. So this is what these guys are. And yeah, as I said, it's really potential, because now from here there is like many symbols that can build up on top of it, and you can come with your own story about what is happening in here, So there is like this vortex that I wanted to create through composition that come down to this blue pit here. And I wanted these monsters to be a mix of gentle characters, ridiculous characters at the same time. And I wanted them to have something extremely scary about their expression, just so I can build the doubt about their intention. This way, it's not really possible to know if they are. See if they have good intention or if they have another thing behind their mind. So the main character here, I wanted her to be a total cliche of hypersexualized representation of girl in society. So this is why I wanted her to have this pink panty and to have like just a slight hint of her breast. And there is no possible way to tell if this character is a young girl or if she's a young woman. This is really what I wanted to create. I wanted to create a situation where, as a viewer, you are observing her in an uncomfortable situation, right? But she's not aware of this. She didn't ask for you to look at her panty, basically. So, as a viewer, you have to decide how you are going to look at her. Do you want to look at her as an object of desire? Do you want to look at her as an innocent girl, which is simply falling into her hole? What story do you want to build about this girl? Do you want, like some people did when I published this image, do you want to look at her as a 7-year-old Alice, which is impossible, because Alice, if she's 7-year-old, she can't have already this kind of body type. And by the way, this is something I really find awesome about Alice in Wonderland, is the discrepancy there is between the affirmation that Alice is 7. This is something I believe we know from the sequel of Alice in Wonderland, where she says that she is 7, and in the same time, when you look at all the things she's going through in Alice in Wonderland, they are more problematic of teenager, changing bodies, representation of your body, which is changing in huge proportion in very short amount of time. And the fact that all the students, all this adult grown-up world that was around you, that was super reassuring and super clear, because your parent helped you to have a clear definition about who is kind and who is not kind, who is bad and who is good. All the students, it starts to change, because you start to you start to have an understanding that the world is much more complicated than that, and you start to be totally confused about this world around you. All of a sudden, there is part of the world that was in existence for you that starts to come to your understanding, and this is extremely scary. And I think Alice in Wonderland for me is really about this moment in life where your body is changing at a teenager age, and it came with a lot of deep questioning about the world you are living in. So Alice, she is falling along with this balloon, which are carrying these spectators. So in a way, these spectators, they are traveling through this initiatic experience with this character. Another thing I wanted to play with in this image at the storytelling level is really what we find in Alice in Wonderland, which is this deep incoherency in scale about different elements. So this is why I really wanted this rabbit here to feel huge. So I had to figure out a way to make it look huge based on the depth of different elements. I really wanted to have this ridiculous scale about all these elements that are working together and that help to make her feel extremely vulnerable and extremely fragile. So overall, the way I see visual storytelling in illustration is to use cultural references, free association, and combinatory plays in order to create a potential for interpretation by your audience, but not giving them a clear explanation about what is going on. And visual storytelling in another context, like visual development for animation, or visual storytelling in concept art for video game or for movie, might be different, because sometimes it's good to be extremely clear and obvious about what is going on. But I think in illustration is something that is meant to be looked at for maybe a bit longer than a concept art or than a visual development piece, which is here to communicate a clear concept or a clear idea about a sequential form of art. But in illustration, you really want to have something that an audience can focus on for more than just 10 or 20 seconds. And by creating this potential for interpretation, then you create a lot more interest for the viewer to look at your image. Combinatory plays and free association are the two tools that I use the most in my images. What are they? So combinatory play is a fact of associating two elements together. This is it, simply it. But this is an extremely powerful tool, because if I ask you right now to pick two of the most unexpected things to put together, and we make a poll and we see what people come with, I think we won't have 2 times the same association. And as simple as it is, associating together 2, 3 or more different elements that shouldn't be together in the first place is one of the simplest and more efficient way to create something new in the limit of what this could mean. And this is a simple tool, but I use it all the time. So yeah, combinatory plays is an extremely important and powerful tool you can use in visual storytelling, in concept art, in visual development. And free association free association is more of a Freudian concept, and is the fact to let your subconscious to do the association work for you. We live in organized society, which means that people that are living in the same society as us have a lot in common with us. We have a lot of difference, obviously, but we have more in common than we have in difference. And free association work at a level where you are going to refer to your own symbolism that you've been constructing through your experience of the world. And by doing this at a visual storytelling level, you can be sure that most of the time the symbolism that you are going to let happen unconsciously in your image is going to talk to someone else who belongs to the same society that you've been in. I mean, it can have huge difference of symbolism between, let's say, West Africa and Vietnam. But if you are from Vietnam and you are building an image for Asian people, chances are that a lot of the symbolism that you've been building unconsciously for yourself is going to work at an unconscious level for other people. And when you let the free association happen, you let your mind solve the problem for you of making two different things work together. And the beautiful things of letting unconscious symbols talk for you is that instead of telling a story to your audience, you are now creating a potential for them to build their own story. Composition. So, composition, I just want to talk about the composition of this image. And here is a rough outline of the composition. And I want to tell already that I didn't plan this composition at all. It happened, but I didn't plan it. And this is something that I developed over time because I really love composition. I love to look at a lot of composition and to look at a lot of images. And at first, I was trying very hard to build my composition from scratch and to plan them very consciously and spend a lot of time to define all the different structure and values and big shapes and so on. But with time, what I started to do instead is just to let, once again, at an unconscious level, let things organize by themselves and just try to move things around at the spot where I feel it looks right. And this is what it gives. This is a post outline I did of the composition. And it just happened. It just a habit of trying to organize things together. So I knew I wanted this kind of huge vortex and spiral that would bring the eye towards this hand and this blue pill. Though at first, as I wasn't sure I wanted to have a blue pill in here, so I knew maybe I could add a blue pill, but I wasn't completely sure. But I knew it would be at the same spot at this hand. And yeah, when I start to look at things generally, I start to balance and to organize elements. I will take, for example, this guy and move it around and say, okay, maybe it's better here, maybe it's better here. And after a while, when I find the correct spot, most of the time I start to realize that things, they are aligned along very strong structures. And I think this is really a product of the habit. But see, all this balloon here is aligned along this feet, along this strong line here, which is going through that shape here and through the clouds, and along the shirt, the line of the shirt, and just the line of the panty here through the shadow of the leg and the feet, and then towards balloon. Honestly, I didn't plan that. Really, I never planned that. But after, when I was constructing the image, I'm going to show you how I'm doing it after technically. But when I'm constructing the image, I keep moving things around. I'm moving the light, I'm moving an element, I push it to the right, to the left, to the top, to the down, changing the light a little bit in key shot, up to the point where I feel it looks right. And most of the time when it looks right, it's because without really thinking about it, it starts to be aligned along a strong structure. I'm trying to figure out if I have something to add, but a few years ago, I used to do super advanced analytical studies of master composition. And I had like this very, very interesting discussion with a friend who said to me, but did you ever try to take a random picture, any random picture, and try to apply this same analytical thinking to this image to see if, after all, maybe this old master, maybe they didn't plan as much as we would like to think they planned. And I started to do that, to take from them picture. I tried to analyze them, and most of the time I was finding myself being conscious of some of these structural elements that was totally random, but that was still here. So I think when you've been exposed enough to composition, even though this structure is just a potential, then after a while, by moving values around, exaggerating plan separation, shape separation, your eye, it tends to spot these strong structural elements, and you tend to want to exaggerate and stylize these alignments of things. So this was just an outline of the structure, because I think the structure is not everything at all in an image. It's just a small part of how you are going to organize edges and values in order to create interest and to lead the eye into the image. Because generally the eye do one simple thing. It goes from the big shape to the small shape. And it goes from rough to details. So I think the important thing to ask is, what is a detail? And I think a detail is not explaining in very small what something is. I think many people tend to think that this is what detail is. You just take something and you explain it with scribbling, and the finest the grain is, the more it is detailed. I don't think this is detailed at an abstract and visual cognitive level. I think at cognitive level, what your eye see as a detail is a high density of small shapes with a high contrast. It might be a high density or simply a high contrast in size. Like for example, here we have let me pick a brush and explain what I'm seeing. We have like here this. Let me pick a terrible color to make sure we see it. There is like this lozenge here. And in this lozenge, which is mostly over general value of this value here, see if I'm opening my window, my color window, well, we are very close in value from here to here. So this is mostly this shape. And inside this shape here, we have a few very small shapes with high contrast. This cloud here, here. And then this is for me, this is detail. Detail, this is it. This is something completely abstract. Detail is abstract because, I mean, if we're looking at this image at this size here, well, we see this kind of triangle here, this kind of V, but we still see this very small spot, bright spot, which detaches itself into this V shape, kind of lozenge shapes, right? So here, another abstract shape here. Composition, it's mostly, for me, about abstract shapes. It's about creating abstract shapes that help you with the image. So there is one shape here, one shape here, one shape, and even if we go broader, this is even one shape here, one big shape, right? And we have, let's see, in very small and black and white, because it's more obvious. Now we have like one shape here. And we have detail here. Again, it starts to become a detail because we have all of a sudden a high density, a higher density of small shapes. So we have this very dark spot here and very bright spot here, and again a bright spot here. So this creates a detail. So the eye is going to spot this detail, and then what the eye tends to do as a natural thing is to follow edges toward another point of high contrast. So right now there is this spot, then there is an edge here, and just after we have another high contrast spot here with this bright spot, and all around a more simple rest area of simplified values. So balancing big shapes with low contrast, with low local contrast, creates resting area for the eyes, and spicing up with this spot, these bright shapes. Like for example, I don't see here a girl and legs. I see a bright spot and another very bright spot in a bigger shape, simplified shapes. And this is detail. This is what the eye is going to catch. You can add as much details as you want in here. Pick a very small brush and just it's like too contrasty and start to add like these crazy details. There is so little contrast in here that the eye is never going to pick this. We don't see it. So this is for me the difference between details and texture. For me, texture, we can see it here, the grain paper. This is a high density of very small details, of very small shapes, not details. High density of very small shapes with a very low contrast. And when you have a high density of small shapes with a low contrast, it is a texture, it's not a detail. And when you start to have a high density and a high contrast in shape size and a high contrast in values, it starts to become a details. And the eye wants to solve what this event is in the visual spectrum. And I just want to refer quickly back at this analytical tool I did for myself. And I think I really want to make a longer video to explain this pyramid. And once again, I just want to repeat that this pyramid is not meant to be like a universal definition of what composition in figurative art is. I think this would be pointless because I don't think art can be bound by rules, by simple rules like that. But for me, it's just an analytical tool that helps me to decide what is important in an image and what is less important. And obviously for me, detail is the less important thing, especially the kind of detail we just talked about before, which is this crazy, super small, low contrast things that we add on top of things, which are in fact just texture. But yeah, abstraction, dynamic, what I just talked about, how you organize your structure, how you organize your shapes in order to create a visual path for the eye to follow along and stay inside the image and go from one spot of storytelling interest to another spot of storytelling interest, because obviously this abstract white shape also belong to at the semantic level here. Yeah, when we start to analyze the image at the semantic level, this bright spot also belong to a character. And this character is interacting with other character through symbols and through action. They interact in order to create a potential for storytelling. Yeah. So I think for now, this is it for what I wanted to cover about composition, because this is a whole entire subject and I can't cover it in this making of because it's not the point. But I hope this is going to be enough to explain how this composition is working. So as I haven't recorded the whole process, I'm going to go through just a couple of files to see the different states they were in, and most important, how I am organizing my workflow between ZBrush and Keyshot in order to focus on the storytelling and the 2D image and not on the sculpt itself. So this is the Keyshot scene. And something I think which is extremely important in my workflow, I believe, is the fact that I'm having this Keyshot window open right since the very, very beginning. As soon as I can, I open Keyshot, and generally I have Keyshot on my second screen. I open Keyshot, I set up a camera and a rough light. And then as soon as I have meaningful geometry, I'm sending my geometry into Keyshot. So this is my 2D Canva. I think about these windows not as my 3D render. I think about these windows as my painting. This is my painting, and I'm starting to paint right from here. And in the process I'm using, that I'm going to show you later, it's extremely important for me to have a very, very clean and almost definitive composition right from the beginning. So when I speak about the composition, I'm not speaking necessarily about the shadow to light ratio or the values ratio, but I'm speaking more about the edges and the structure of the image, because it's going to be, in my process, much more complicated. It's not impossible, it's totally possible, but it's going to be more complicated to move things around later in Photoshop. So generally, if suddenly I realize that I've completely messed up my composition, I can move things around, but I tend to move them later in the process in Photoshop. So what I wanted to emphasize is that focusing on composition very early at this stage of the painting, because it's really painting here, is very important. So I try also to reuse a lot when I'm building these images, because the point is not to improve my sculpting skills. When I want to improve at sculpting, I'm doing series. recently I wanted to improve at sculpting and portraying characters, so I did a series about that. But in these images, I tried to reuse as much as I can. So I believe most of these characters, unfortunately, I don't have the history now about these characters, but most of these characters, if I remember properly, there are base meshes that I took from here. So I think there is this mesh here, Julie, that I used, I think, for this one here. And if you look at it closely, you can see there is roughly the same pose we have on Julie. So I took Julie. I can quickly show you the kind of stuff I did. Pick Julie. I started to. No, there is subdivision. Took my inflate brush. Started to inflate the character just to destroy the indications of geometry and maybe do this because I had this idea for the main character in the first place, so it was much simpler for me to simply go from a base mesh and simply start to deform it. It's much faster like that. And I think after that I did something in that style, just selected part of the geometry and started to use deformations, inflate the geometry like that, flatten it. Just having fun with trying to think about the character and not especially about the performance of sculpting. And I try to stay, when I'm starting, I'm trying to stay as rough as possible because I want to be able to send a geometry in Keyshot as soon as possible. Inflate, deform, move down. Yeah, and we have kind of the same character that we had in here. Tuck, 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 where it is. Ah, it's funny because, okay, now I know. There is a name here. So it was with the Nixie human mal average. So it's here, it's this one. So I did it with this one, but as you see, I've been able to replicate the same character in 5 minutes, kind of 5 minutes with Julie. So it doesn't matter. I mean, I could have done it from scratch. It really doesn't matter. Yeah. So once I have my character, I'm sending it as soon as possible into Keyshot. Yeah. So same thing for this one. Maybe this one was from a Julie. I don't remember. Yeah. No? Julie. Yeah. It has a name. So this one was from the Julie mesh. So this one was from a DAZ 3D model, but as you can see, there is nothing much left from the DAZ 3D model. That's why it's called Genesis. This one too was from a DAZ model. And I quickly deformed it the same way, just blowing things around with the inflate brush and try to destroy very quickly the initial anatomy, because I really want to go as fast as I can towards the idea I have. So reusing, I'm trying to reuse a lot. So for this rabbit, I quickly looked on. I quickly looked on Turbo Squid if I could find just a quick model, because I feel no pride in sculpting a rabbit. So if I can find a rabbit that can work for me, I will take it, and it can make me gain, you know, always an hour of work. So for $10, it worth it. Because my point here is about telling a story. It's not about sculpting an amazing rabbit. And I found that this rabbit had just the correct level of cartooniness I wanted. And overall, the way I painted on top of it afterward, I managed to get rid of the over cartoony stuff that was obvious in the character, because I just wanted to have like a base mesh I could deform quickly and send it in keyshot to have an element to interact with my light, and try to figure out if my patterns of light and shadows were going to work in my composition. And after that, once I have the base mesh, I can always just, you know, change it so it can work for me the same way. This was Daz, this was Julie, and this was the Nick Humal base human anatomy Nixie Carrello in the brush. And yeah. So same thing, reuse a lot. So these rocks here in the background, you know, I just took some base rocks and I think these are rocks from, I forgot the name of the artist. Yes, I remember. This was rocks from David L'Esperance tutorial I bought on Gumroad. And he had like this base rock, and I just took it and smashed a lot of rock together just to have a background, because once again, this is not an image about having beautiful rocks, and as you can see, we can't even see them at the end. But for me, having something already done, it made me gain time, and it helped me to concentrate about what really matters for me, and it is thinking about light, shadow, composition, and storytelling. And once I have like a base geometry in keyshot, I'm really trying to think about my composition. So I have this windows open on the other screen, and basically if I start to realize that something doesn't work, I'm just picking, you know, my rabbit, and I try to always be conscious of where my camera is. So I know that my camera is somewhere here, and it's let me show you where I think my camera is. I would need to disable this autosave feature right now. So my camera is like somewhere here. So if I want to move my rabbit in space, to put it backward, but keep roughly the same orientation to our camera, I can simply move it like that and render and send this to keyshot. So let me get back the correct material I had. So I generally simply use a 50% gray material. So I can really concentrate about the structure of the composition based on edges and light and shadow patterns. So at this point, it's really a game of moving things around, you know, deciding, okay, maybe I want this curve here to go more in the back, right? The curve of this character. So I can simply go in the brush, grab my move brush, select this dude, put it in solo mode, and isolate the arms like that. You know, and move the back a bit. And a lot of the work I did in this image was about thinking about my cast shadows in this image. So after I'll show you, I started to add shadow caster to change the way the shadows were acting with the visible geometry. And also a lot of the work I'm doing in 3D involve cheating with 3D, because most of the time I think in a beginner work I see this happen all the time. People, they tend to overstate the importance of 3D, and because this is 3D, they tend to think that, okay, this is 3D, so this is right, you know. And it doesn't have to be right or wrong. I think what is right is what looks right. It's not what is in the brush or what is right in the physical 3D world. It has an importance at some point to stay coherent, so the illusion can work, but you can perfectly cheat. Like, for example, I cheated with this character by only adding the head of the character, and here is the shadow caster I was talking about. So it's a simple geometry to cast the shadows over this character. And this head here, I just had the head because I didn't want to have his torso in front of the geometry, because I knew I wanted just after the chin, I wanted to have this big dark shape we have here. See, so I completely cheated with the 3D, because right now it's just a head floating in the air, and if it has actually a real torso, we should see the torso that will come maybe probably through here, no. So yeah, it's a cheat. So it's the same for this character here. It's just a head floating in the air. Okay, so let's move to a later stage. So here is a more final ZBrush file. And once the composition was there with the big and simplified shapes. So as you can see, nothing has. I didn't have a lot of change since the first file. So most of the composition stage, it happened at a moment where I tried to have very few details on my shades, because you can see it's a 20 million polygon scene, so it starts to become a bit more difficult to move things around. There is like a bit of lag and delay, so this is why I really try to solve the composition problem very early with very simple shapes. Just try to go straight to the point, reuse as much as I can, as long as it doesn't constrain me in my creativity. And when I have a composition that looks right, then I will start to add the details that I think are relevant to add in 3D. Because there is always a fine balance to find between detailing in 3D and detailing in 2D. Anything that is related to textures and materials, for me, it's really faster to do it in 2D. But all the interesting details that are going to interact with the lights and act as kind of a bevel with a light side and shadow side, they are faster to do in 3D. So I prefer to do it that way. So I wanted this character to have a bit of this bee appearance. So this is why I wanted to have this kind of flower-like designed with these big eyes that refer more to a bee-like type of character. And I wanted, as I explained in the first place, I wanted these characters to look a bit both monstrous and ridiculous. So they could like either they would look either dangerous or either gentle, depending on who is reading the image and what mood they are in. And you can see I decided to move the rabbit around and to make it look very, very small. So let me have a look at this character here. I'm going to zoom into it. Sorry, it's not the proper rabbit. So this thing about reusing is also to gain time. It's not about not being able to sculpt something and having to use a mesh instead. I mean, I think I have no issue at all for sculpting a rabbit or sculpting a character or whatever. So if at some point something is start to make me lose time because I have to look on the internet for something, I'm going to sculpt it. So it really depends. If I can find something on the internet or in my reference folder to use because I think about it, and if I can find it in less than 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to use it. Otherwise, I'm going to sculpt something from scratch. So here's this rabbit with a bit of clothing. And once again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just to catch the light and add a bit of indication of how the light and shadows are going to interact with the shape, so I can paint over later in the process. And here is this character, which is here. So same here, it's just a DAZ 3D model that I posed, and once I posed it, I resculpted a lot on top of it to really make it work for me, because DAZ 3D is really, honestly, an amazing tool. It's really fantastic, but the meshes I use mostly the Genesis meshes because I have a library of things and deformers for it. So I really like this mesh, though it starts to be a bit old. But I don't know if this solves that in the more recent version of Genesis. But this first version, Genesis, it has a lot of anatomy issues. And it has a very strong print. I mean, I can generally tell if someone used a Genesis mesh and didn't took the time to resculpt on top of it, because it has like very specific anatomical imperfection and marks, and it really shows, especially in the feet and in the hands. So generally, I try to resculpt the calves. I try to resculpt every part of the mesh that is visible first, because, like, for example, here I didn't resculpted the head because it wasn't visible that much. But apart from that, I resculpted the breast, I resculpted the hand, because especially the hands, I really wanted to have more expressive hands, so I did resculpted them to have more interesting fingers and anatomy. And every time that I'm doing something, I really try to, as much as I can, as often as I can, send my updates in Keyshot. I try to never use what I see in ZBrush to decide whether it's good or not. Obviously, I have to see what I'm doing, so I'm looking at it the moment I'm resculpting a bit the hand, for example. I'm going to look at what I'm doing, but what is important is the result in my Canva, and it's not the result in ZBrush. And when I talk about cheating in 3D, I do it a lot. So for example, here I had an issue with the fit. So I'm going to show you the different stages here. So it was my first rough sketch to decide my composition. Then I started to refine the composition a bit and try to organize my main vortex with the balloons. I already had in mind when I was doing that I would add all these clouds to help link each of these elements together. Then I started to add Alice, and when I was adding this main character, I had like a specific problem with the camera lens. And here I'm using a very wide lens. Let me show you. It's a 25 millimeters, and it starts to be quite a wide lens. And the issue with wide lens in 3D happen especially with characters, because as much as environment is concerned, I think environments and architecture react very well to wide lens. It can create very interesting patterns and yes, abstract patterns. But for characters, it starts to create like super weird deformations that doesn't work at all. And this was happening with the fit. So the fit here was very generic, very DAZ-like fit. So I started to resculpt the pose and start to find something more interesting to express the fall. And now I fixed it. The issue I had, especially with the right foot, was a size issue. The right foot, it was looking absolutely huge. And this is because of the lens. So what I did, I totally cheated with the fit. As you can see now, I reduced the size of the fit a lot. It doesn't make sense to have such a small fit in reality. And the right fit, is much smaller than the left fit. Because even though I had reduced the size of both fits, the left one, which is closer to the camera, was still looking way too big. So I had to size it down to make it work. So cheating with 3D to have something that works in 2D is very, very important. And something also different happened with wide lens, and this is why I try to think about this as my painting right from the beginning, and I try to decide of what I'm doing in 3D based on this projection. And the specific thing that happened with a wide lens is a deformation that tends to compress things increasingly as you go towards the center of the image. And this is why it's, for me, when I try to do photography with wide lens, I have issues, because nature isn't necessarily organized in a way that allows to find really nice composition. So I'm always in admiration for photographers that manage to do really, really good composition with wide lens, because I think it's something actually really difficult for me. It's difficult for me to find a spot in nature which has the correct balance of elements that are going to work properly with a wide lens. Most of the time it starts to blow the details in the border of the image, and it starts to have like a too high density of details in the center of the image. But in 3D, when we are making images, we can specifically choose to organize our elements so they are going to counterbalance this wide lens effect. So see, this is what I did in this image. Because I was organizing my elements right into ZBrush and always fully aware of the 3D projection, I could really decide to, move the shapes around to really focus on the 2D projection. So on the abstract shapes. This is a shape, this is a shape, this is a shape. And I didn't want to have this specific, very dense organization of shape in the center of the image, while I have only big wide shapes at the outside. I hope this makes sense. Cheating with 3D, again, very important. Like for example, for this main character that is falling down, and all this part of the scene here, mainly I mean all this part here, it doesn't make sense in 3D based on what I'm trying to explain. The story I'm telling here is about this part of the scene, this character and these balloons, they are falling straight toward the center of the hole. But as you can see, this is not what is happening in 3D. In 3D, they are falling nowhere, basically. They are falling not even in this character, Yeah, the main character is here, you can see. It's very small, so we don't necessarily see it, but let me use another shader. So basically, this character is falling nowhere, and only the rabbit is actually falling into the hole. And the thing is, I had to cheat with that because it wasn't possible with my current camera to have all of these elements working the way I wanted them to work. So I just had to cheat. This is what I wanted to say. 3D is not meant to be true or to be false. It's just a tool to paint. It's just a tool to create images in this process. It's just a painting process. So what matters is the final composition. It's not whether it's possible or not possible. So I'm just going to move this scene around to show you the shadow casting, because it's very important. So let's take this piece of geometry here, and I'm going to get back to my main camera, shot cam, and remove it. And a small part of it was in order to create these bottom dark patterns, but I also wanted to be able to correct specifically as much as I can. I think it was a 21, I believe. Yeah. So once again here, I had this idea to create this vortex kind of elements. So this is why I wanted to have as much as possible lines that were flowing in that direction. So it could be extremely easy to fix in 2D, but if it doesn't take time for me to fix it in 3D, I'm fixing it in 3D. So I just move around my shadow caster behind it in order to have this specific pattern in here. So I think here, same thing. No, it doesn't cast anything, so I think it's fine. So if I'm moving in performance mode, so I can tumble around more easily, yeah, we can see that this scene mostly doesn't make sense as soon as I'm looking at it from another angle. And honestly, apart from really some specific moment where I needed to select an object which was outside of the camera, as I did now, to select that one, for example, I mostly never moved away from this main camera angle. I saved a couple other camera angles, so what is this one? This one is maybe a slight change. Let me see. No, it's the exact same camera. So most of the time I was only in this camera angle trying to really fix things, move things around and having them to work and, you know, try the little, very little composition problems. So what I call a composition problem is, for example, how do I organize these elements so they are not boring? So there is like just the proper balance of distance between two elements. So they are not equal, but they are not too close one to another. So we lose this idea of chaining of elements. And even right now, in this mode, what I'm trying to see is what is the structure of the composition. So even though there is no self-shadow that allows to see the patterns of dark values and bright value, sometimes I'm just moving in this mode to really focus on edges. Going back into basic mode just to have the patterns. So it's really a matter of, for example, as I said before, how to organize things with interest. So this one is in the light, and this one move into shadows. So this helps to create patterns of values that break the uniformity of this spiral, because there is a danger that this spiral becomes too obvious if all of the elements are more or less organized in a too regular way. So now by playing with local colors and having this one to detach from the background thanks to a brighter local colors, it's possible to have a more interesting organization of values to make this spiral work in a more dynamic way. Rendering. So I think none of the process I'm following either in 3D, either in ZBrush or in Keyshot is really specific to Keyshot and ZBrush. You can replicate this in any 3D package you like to use. So once I have my composition done, I mean, this is my final pass. So right now I have just the proper amount of details I want, and I know that most of the other details I'm going to fix this into Photoshop and also simplify some part of the image. Then I'm doing my rendering. So I've been rendering this at 6K wide, even though I did the image at 8K. Well, not wide, tall, 8K tall. So this was rendered at 6K, and I've been working at 8K in Photoshop. But this is perfectly enough for the need I have. So generally what I do is I'm rendering, I'm looking at my passes. I'm rendering generally one diffuse pass. So I just want to have the perfectly matte material information. Basically where is the light and where is the shadow. So this is one pass. Then I like to do this no self shadow pass. So basically this is a pass with, this is the simplest type of rendering you can do, where there is no cast shadow whatsoever. And this is an interesting pass because it helped me generally to redefine the local shading of the elements. Because sometimes with this kind of pass, which have some really nice bounce light and some very interesting, very nice lighting quality, where there is like this very nice bounce light from one object to another, and it's really interesting, but it tends to obfuscate some of the local shading, which can be useful to separate one element to another. Like for example here there is like this quite nice bounce light on the shoulder from this character behind, but in some situation it can become a bit of an issue because we are lacking the local shading information that helps to exaggerate how the form is turning, and sometimes it's useful at the composition level. So this is why I'm doing this pass, and it doesn't take very long to render. This pass is something that you can do natively in KitShot, but I think you can do it in any software, and it's a normal orientation pass. So it's simply I think basically a normal map for. It's a pass with a normal map applied directly on the material. So it can help to select top facing plane, or just make some finer selection. And sometimes it's interesting to just quickly bring some color variation. Another very important pass, obviously, it's a depth pass. So I'm doing the depth pass rendering. It's not me. It's once again KeyShot which does this, but it's rendered at 32 bits. So it's important to render at 32 bits to be able to select all these finest details that we can see right now. If the map were done in 8 bits, it wouldn't be possible to get any of the details which are in here. But thanks to the 32 bits, all the information of depth, they are present even in the blackest black and the whitest white. It's possible to retrieve all the information. So I'm doing an ID pass. So in KeyShot it's called a clone pass, but you can do an ID pass in your favorite package very easily. It's a pass which is very useful for the entire 3D process. So normally if you've been studying 3D, or if you don't know how to do it, you can look on the internet. If you're using Maya, Blender, whatever, it's very easy to do an ID pass. So an ID pass is extremely important because as I'm really working as much as I can to solve my composition as much as I can in 3D, it means that my edges are mostly not going to change. And if I need to change some edges and change the size of some elements, I will mostly do it later in the rendering process. So I can rely on this pass to quickly select any shape I want and start to build my rendering in Photoshop. So it's very, very, very important and very useful pass. And I'm doing like this very tight occlusion rendering. And this occlusion pass, I try to focus almost on a line type of rendering. So it generally helped me to exaggerate some of the feature of the geometry, just to help like more draw some elements, because sometimes once again with the very nice bounce light, some elements start to disappear, and I use this map to help me to exaggerate some of the local features. And these are two different types of reflection map. So what I'm interested in these maps is just to get the information of reflection, obviously, that I'm going to use to build my materials. And I don't remember if I use this pass or not. It's very noisy, so maybe this is a pass I stopped before it finished. I don't know. Then I did some material specific passes for the skin. So I just did a quick translucent material pass for both the clothing and the skin. And I think I don't know why I did both. Maybe there is different setting. I don't remember. But it just to get a quick indication of translucency. And translucency, it's easy to build by hand in Photoshop, but it doesn't take that much time to render, especially in Keyshot, because Keyshot is damn fast. So why not doing it? And then once I did that, I'm doing all of my texture passes. So texture passes, and after that I'm going to show you why I'm doing this in Keyshot. But basically these texture passes, they are just a box projection of any kind of texture on the geometry. So a box projection, if you don't know what it is, it's simply like you imagine Keyshot is looking at the orientation of each face, and if the normal is pointing toward one of the face of the box, it's going to project the texture in that direction. So it's a very quick and very fast way to projecting texture in an interesting way on the geometry. It wouldn't work for very accurate texture projection in a 3D pipeline, but for illustration it's perfect, because it allows me to create these random maps, these random texture maps, and after that, once again, I'm going to show you the texture I'm using. And generally, I don't really know what I'm going to do with these textures, but I just let my mind, the free association and so on. Okay, I'm dropping a texture, I'm messing around with parameters, and if I find it cool, and I'm just spotting maybe for some part of the image a pattern or a color variation that seems interesting, so I'm rendering it. Various textures. It's just to have like textures already there, so I can mess around with them in Photoshop. So let me show you how I do that. So I love fractals, and I love fractal softwares, and I love to render sometimes if I have a bit of spare time. I like to experiment with fractals and try to generate these nice textures. So these are a bunch of textures I generated a while ago. And I really love them because they really help me to create these random texture passes that I'm going to use later for compositing. Really, really nice texture. So I did experimented with a lot of different fractal softwares. Most of them, they are open source and free to use. And you can go on Google and check for 2D fractals, and you'll see a really amazing number of softwares you can try for yourself. They're really very interesting. So the way I'm doing it in Keyshot, I'm selecting like my main material. I only have one material. Because I'm doing render passes, it makes my life easier than having like various different materials. So I try to have like just one material, and it allows me for a very straight and simple process. So if I want to do an ambient occlusion map, I can select from here my occlusion and just play with the radius depending on the type of a render pass I want to create. And for this texture passes, I just use a flat materials which has no shading, and I'm dropping a texture just like that on here, selecting my color channel, and you can see there is like these different types of projections. Sometimes I'm trying other projections. I'm not always using the box map because some other types of projections are really interesting to obtain certain effects. And then you can play with the position of the mapping. Change the angle, change the scale, and it will depend on your 3D package, but most 3D package, they offer a queuing, a render queue system. So it's really, really interesting because sometimes it can take time. So as you can see, I did it with Ctrl U. So there is a shortcut here. And when I'm pressing Ctrl U, I'm adding this rendering to the queue. So here I don't have the proper setting, but what I would do instead generally is go in basic mode, select just 4 samples, and let's delete this job. And I can render it, you can see even at full resolution of my final image, which is 8K, you'll see that these 4 samples, they are going to render extremely, extremely fast. Because basically it's a simple projection of the texture onto the geometry. And this queuing process, it allows me to prepare all my render passes at the end of my workday, and during the night I can have the computer to work for me, and it will be able to render a huge amount of these passes in the night. And I can just program my diffuse, my reflection pass, and if I have a couple of other rendering pass, I'm trying to plan them at that moment. And it's only showing this at 2K tall. So it's going to take overall 1 minute to render at 8K. So at 6K it should be 40 seconds, I don't know, maybe 60 seconds. Very fast. So this is how I'm doing all of these passes. Dropping a texture, try to think about the kind of materials I want to simulate with it. And yes, it could be seen as a waste of time because it's rendering this texture all over the place, either whether I'm going to use it everywhere or not. But honestly, it doesn't matter because it's very fast. It's all rendered in JPEG, so it doesn't take that much space on my hard drive. And it creates potential for creativity later in Photoshop, which is very interesting. And for the other type of materials, it's really straightforward. I'm selecting a diffuse, removing any kind of texture information, select a 50% gray, and in the lighting mode, I really don't try to optimize my render at all. I'm selecting this full simulation mode. Maybe it's a waste of computing power because I don't need it, but honestly, as I can run it run the rendering over the night. It doesn't take that much time, and you know, depending of if I'm most of the time for this diffuse passes 64 samples, is totally fine. Even 32 is fine. I mean, and for the reflection pass, I'm moving back into my basic mode because I don't need to have as much ray bounce, and I'm going to pick my material, and I'm going to choose a black as local color because I'm only looking to have the information about reflection. I generally never render this type of pass right there. I think most of the time they are pretty useless to have like this very accurate reflection, and there is an issue of the materials that start to reflect themselves. So sometimes I have to take care about that. But I generally do two kind of render pass, like one with a 0.1 roughness, and sometimes a 0.05. It depends of the level of granularity I want to have. And sometimes I go up to 0.25. It's really on a per scene basis. It depends on the type of material I have in my scene and the kind of roughness I want to simulate. Compositing. So now let's move into Photoshop and go through the files, the 10 files I recorded one by one to see. So this was one stage. As you can see, it's pretty weird. Okay, so at this stage I didn't name my folders properly, all of them, but here I have my lighting informations. So this is something I tend to do often because I really like this way of organizing my rendering. And I put all of my lighting information into one folder, and I put this folder in hard light mode. And what it does, and I'm going to show you this easily like that, I'm going to group this and put this into overlay mode. And let's call that one hard light. And put this one obviously into overlay. So overlay and hard light, they have the opposite effect. So if you put one layer on top of another in hard light, or you put the bottom layer on top of the first one in overlay mode, it doesn't change anything. They are the opposite. And what I like about this process is I can use this layering in order to slowly build up my local colors from underneath my lighting information, and then later I can continue to build up some more local colors on top of my lighting information. Because of the limitation of this hard light algorithm, there is only so far you can go with local colors and materials. So there is some type of materials that won't be possible to build with this workflow. But the main advantage is that it helps to preserve the initial lighting information and not destroy them too much. So it's really great to safely build local colors. So I generally drop my main diffuse pass on top of everything. So I believe this one is the render pass where I only have local shading and not cast shadows, just to help emphasize the local shading. It just add a bit more definition. Then I have dropped in here my normal orientation map with a bit of hue saturation and an adjustment layer on top of everything, because when the lighting information contains too much white, this is why I corrected it, it starts to blow the colors underneath, and it's really not interesting. So I try to be careful to have a limited range of values in my hard light layer group of layers. And same here. So the beauty of the hard light and basically all of the layer mode that are in here: overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light, hard mix. I'm not sure for this pin light, hard mix, I never use them, and vivid light, I don't use it often, but I know for sure that linear light, hard light, soft light, overlay, they act in a way where they stay neutral if you have 50% gray underneath. And what I mean by that is, let me show you. If I pick a 50% gray and I'm inverting it, you know, 50% gray is the neutral point where it doesn't have any effect. Hard light. And this is great. Yeah, I thought this was strange. Okay, you can see it doesn't change anything. So let's make a big white in here. So it's the same for overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light. Yeah, so it works for this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have this 50% gray, and then I'm starting to build my local colors from here. So what I really love about this process is now, because this local colors layer, group of layers, it is underneath my shading information, my lighting information. Prefer use the word lighting than shading. Okay, because it's underneath, I can use any combination. As you can see, if you look in here, it's a normal layer. Here I have another one which is in color mode, and this one is in soft light, and this one is in overlay, and this one in screen, and this one in soft light again. So it allows me to use all of the capacity of Photoshop to build an interesting local color layer underneath my lighting information. So then I start to add textures. So let's get back to the initial one to make sure I'm not screwing up anything. Texture on top of it. And now I'm starting to change the local colors with like strongest statement. So this base underneath path is just temporary, just to have something, so it's not like a white canvas, it's like an underneath texture, but slowly I'm going to tweak and remove a lot of this very strong information. The thing I like to think about the way I'm working is I'm trying in a way to art direct happy accidents. So this is why I'm doing all of these render passes before knowing even if I'm going to need them, because I want to create a potential for happy accident to happen, and then I'm going to drop these textures and try to mess with layer modes and just create something unexpected and just look and try to decide if it looks right or not. So I want to close this one and open the next one. My stage 2. So it was like 1 hour after. And I tend to have like very big files. This is a byproduct of my workflow where I have a lot of layers, and you can see it's a 2.15 gigabits file, so it's a bit big. So this is why at some point generally I name my files with the activity I'm doing at the moment. So right now I'm in the compositing, and at that moment the file started to become too huge, close to 3 gigs. So I flattened, I'm going to show you that later, I flattened a part of the file to make sure I could simplify it. So here we are. So a lot of improvements since the last one. Let me get back to the first one, so we can see the improvement from one to another. I'm going to close Keyshot to free some of my memory. Okay. You can see. So I was already here at 8K in size. So I imported all of my textures files I needed since the beginning, so I could later just upsize my file and work on it. So it's a bit more clean now as far as the organization goes. So basically, I have my colors here. And right here, I have my underneath. Did I say colors? I have my lighting here. Underneath, I have my local colors. And here I have my depth. Let's put it in blue. And here I have my mood. And I think I'm going to record this one so you can have it for later. So let's get back to where we were before. So there is already quite a significant change, but I don't necessarily go from bottom to top, which means that sometimes I'm going to drop some atmospheric depth, and this is going to impact on my local colors. So then I'm going to go down again and start to tweak my local colors or my lighting. It depends. Here I'm in the local colors layer to still have at the top of the stack an interesting color balance. So depth, atmospheric depth is a bit of a challenge, because it's not only about being realistic with how atmospheric works, but I think it's also about stylizing exposure and start to crush details in shadows and in highlights to make the image, to simplify the image and make it more interesting. So here I just dropped, you can see it's a perfectly normal layer, and I use my depth map here to decide where this layer was starting to interact. Because atmospheric perspective, what happened in atmospheric perspective? What happened is that light is moving through the atmosphere, and the atmosphere, the way it behaves in Earth, at least on Earth, it tends to scatter the higher end of the light spectrum. So as you know the light is behave in two different ways. It's particles which are traveling always at the same speed, but these particles, they have specific property that makes them behave as wavelengths. This is me drawing a really nice wave. And the spectrum of the light that we can see, what we can see and we call light, in fact, is just a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this spectrum is composed of a series of an infinite series of various wavelengths. And the longer wavelengths, they tend to be the warmer colors, and the shorter wavelengths, they tend to be the colder wavelengths. So this is me explaining scientifically how light works. Sorry guys, if you are science nerds, you already know that, and you probably find that my explanation is a total failure, but it's important to understand that, at least for us artists, because once you start to really understand the nature of light, a lot of things start to become really easier to figure out by yourself, because atmospheric perspective can behave in such a wide range of complex manner, depending on, is there like a lot of moisture in atmosphere? Is there like particles? If you are in a desert environment and there is a lot of particles that are small particles that are floating in the air, is there like pollution? All of these start to change the way atmosphere behaves. So understanding atmospheric perspective for me is two things. First, understand the physics of light. It's very important to understand how the electromagnetic spectrum works, and understand why do we have local colors, and basically what light is. I think it's especially for realistic rendering, it's really important. Whether it's not because you are using 3D and like the 3D software is doing a lot of the work for you. 3D software, it won't render atmospheric depths. Soon enough, I think it's going to do it. But anyway, you'll still have to art direct the software to make sure that the software is doing something that is meaningful at the composition level. So you'll still have to understand why things behave in a certain way to be able to stylize them. And these wavelengths, right, when they go through the different layers of basically the oxygen molecules that exist in the air, the high part of the spectrum is going to scatter in the atmosphere. So it means that the atmosphere is going to be filled with a very, very cold light. And now, when, for example, this part, the light which bounce from, let's say, this character here, this part here, is going to receive light from the sun. So it's going to receive mostly a warmer light, because a lot of the cold part of the lighting has been scattered in the atmosphere. So this is going to receive here, a warm light. Okay. But here in the shadows, On the contrary, we don't receive the direct light from the sun. This part of the geometry is going to receive the scattered cold light, which is part of the sky dome. And this is why here the lighting is going to appear to be colder. Now, when both these light rays are going to bounce on the surface to go toward our direction and reach whatever our eyes or the lens of the camera, they are going to move through layers and layers and layers of colder light that is already scattered in the atmosphere, okay? And what is going to happen is that these layers of cold light, they are going to change the local colors we see from the object and slightly move it toward in a colder light temperature. And the other thing that happen is that most of the details that exist in the shadows, because their intensity is not strong enough to go through the effect of the light that already exist in the atmosphere, then we are slightly going to lose a lot of these details. So here I added, because it's deeper in the downside of the geometry, I added a bit of this dark layer at the bottom, because it makes no sense to have like these bright values in here. So here I'm adding another layer on lighten, and now I'm correcting my levels just to really add this feeling of overall light scattered everywhere with a simple level. And now with a color layer, I will start to slightly move, not slightly, here it's a bit strong, to really move the spectrum that is receding, the part of the geometry that is receding in space. I want to move the spectrum toward a colder light temperature. And here it's just a slight correction of hue, where I slowly moving the color temperature a bit more toward a bluish hue. Whether here I'm a bit more toward a cyan hue. So, yeah, it didn't change things too much. And on top of everything, I try to get my mood, my general mood. And the way I see rendering process, I really try to separate each and every part of the rendering on separate layer. And the same way in movies, color artists are color grading the final result to get an interesting color palette for a specific scene. I try to keep my mood in a separate layer on top of everything. This way I don't have to destroy any of the previous information I have, and it also gets easier to completely change the mood if I want at some point. And you know, if I decide, I don't know, for some reason to do a sunset or more of a sunset type of lighting, even though we are not in a sunset situation, but you know, I can just pick an adjustment layer and start to completely mess around. Again, with my mood. Yeah, and which slightly change the color mood. It could be definitely stronger if I'm more heavy-handed, you know. So it creates another type of color mood. At some point in this process, it starts to become essential to flatten the file because it's really too huge and there is too much layer. It starts to become laggy in Photoshop because like at 8,000 pixel tall, there is like not far from maybe 100 layers, so it starts to be really too difficult to work with. And what I really love about this process is right now, because it's all separated, at this stage, I'll come back in details later on what I do, but at this stage, I start to be happy with a part of the image, mostly the underneath part under the depth. So what I can do is just select anything underneath the depth layer and just flatten. And this is what I'm going to do in the next file. Flatten everything underneath. And this is the second stage of my painting process. And in the last stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten everything apart from the mood, because I always like to keep my mood separated and my paint over. And by doing this, I'll be able at this stage to start to move things around if I decide that this rabbit is not big enough, or I could tweak maybe its orientation a bit. It's the moment where I can simply copy past part of the image on itself and start to tweak things around and paint over it. At that moment, everything is going to be here: the color, the mood, the composition is almost there, so it's not really difficult to just copy and paste part of the image and make bigger change in size or in positioning. But if I did my work at designing the composition properly, I shouldn't have to do that. You can see since the last one, pretty big improvement in this one. So this is the final one, intermediate. You can see we are really close to final in here. So I'm going to maybe remove this one just so we can see these both. So here, what I did, I fixed, you can see at the composition level, I work on separating a little more my shapes, push things into shadow where I don't need to have details, exaggerate, precise the composition, hide the clouds and so on. So let's get back to where we were before. Depth and mood. So you can see even in these few stages, I already tweaked my atmospheric perspective to have something closer to what I wanted. Remove a bit of this yellowish cast there were on local colors everywhere, and exaggerate a bit more the depth to separate this falling character from the background and really help to make her feel isolated and alone in her fall. So I just exaggerated the darks down there, corrected the what's the word? The contrast, because it was still too contrasty, because in the process of the light bouncing from a distance towards the camera on your eyes or your eyes, the light not only scatter in the shadow to obfuscate the details in shadows and lighten the shadows, it also tends to lose a bit of its energy, because obviously if a light ray coming to you is bouncing around in the atmosphere, it won't reach your eye. So it means that the total amount of energy that is bouncing from this surface toward your eyes is going to be a bit less powerful when it reaches you, and it translates into less light that comes to you because this light is bouncing around in the atmosphere. So generally, with atmospheric perspective comes not only a lighting of the shadow part, but also a slight decrease in contrast and in overall value. So this is a mistake I see often beginners do. They tend to blow the light with the distance, which is not what is happening in the real world. In the real world, objects in distance, even the light, very, very light objects, maybe apart from objects reflecting directly the sun, because they will still send a huge amount of energy, but other objects, even white objects, they will tend to lose a bit of their value in the light side when they reach you. So I believe this is mostly what the changes I did at the atmospheric depth. So I probably did a few changes at the local colors too, as you can see. So I exaggerated the, let me remove everything so you can see. At the local colors, I started to remove also a lot with a depth mask here. I started to remove a lot of the local contrast because I don't need this contrast, and this is something that is difficult to achieve at the depth folder alone. So I'm trying to do it also at the local colors folder, and I try to decrease the contrast in the local texture of objects. You know, it's a simple luminosity layer, and basically you see I just totally reduced the range of values. So this way it allows to really simulate a better blending change, sorry. Depths. If I'm adding only my depths, you can see that it really already helped to convey a sense of depth with distance, where local colors, they start to simplify toward a flat color. And on top of that, if I'm adding my lighting informations, you know, these rocks in the background, they start to feel really, really far away, because not only their shadow parts start to be occluded and doesn't have any details, the brightest side, which is into the light, send much less energy than objects that are closer to us. And last, the local contrast of the object itself start to move toward a flat color. So all these elements help to create a real sense of depth. So at the mood layer, I see I've added a couple corrections. So right now the sky is way too bright, but I believe this is something I fixed later in the process. And when I start to separate my elements one from another, I generally add that on top of my depth layer, because the thing is, my depth map layer folder, my depth folder, it contains a map with very defined edges. So I can't add my separation underneath this layer, because the depth is going to mess with the layers. So this, my depth maps is destroying all this work. So I'm adding my separation on top of my depth. So here it's just mostly like simple, very simple layer, normal layer, a lighten layer. I don't even know what it is doing. Sometimes I have, okay, it's for the rabbit. So it's almost imperceptible. It's very, very, very slight adjustment. But these very slight adjustments are what makes the difference at the end. So I really wanted to push this rabbit down into the distance to really make it feel way bigger than she is. And it is way bigger, but because there is no overlap in composition right now, there is no element overlapping that help to decide whether she is in front or just near him. The same thing for those elements. So repetition in composition help the audience to understand the principle of scale. So here there is a lot of repetition. We see this balloon here in big with the guys in here. We can more or less understand that because they seem to have a normal scale, they probably have the same scale than her. So this gives a first indication of scale. Then this one is way smaller and this one smaller. So we understand based on the principle of repetition of shape, of identical shape, then this one is farther in space. But this is not enough to give an information about the rabbit. So this is why slowly I started to build up more separation. So in this layer, I'm working on separating shapes with broad gradients of values. You know, the shoulder in here, and starting to help in separating the main character from the background with a reduction of contrast mainly and darkening of the values. And then the clouds are the key to creating a layering of elements that now will help to understand that the rabbit is farther in space, thanks to this final piece, right? Because now this one gives us an indication of scale. Yeah, so we can understand that this balloon is farther in space than the character. And then this one even farther. And now this one, it is on top of this layer of cloud. Yeah, and we can understand because there is continuity that this layer of cloud is like at the same level. And now this cloud is going on top of the rabbit, so there is no confusion. We now understand that this rabbit is very far in space and it's like much, much, much bigger than Alice. So paint over, I have like my paint over underneath my depth. So this is mostly simulating the subsurface scattering that is occurring in the fabric elements, and a slight correction of value for Alice, and now my paint over on top of everything. And next stage, I will flatten all these elements. So the color code I'm using in here, generally these are the color code I start to use for myself when my file start to become very, very complex. So I don't necessarily add all of these color codes, but generally I have the gray for the separation, and I have a couple other color code I use. So this helped me to quickly go through my file and find the elements I'm looking for. So here, this is when I've been actually flattening the file. Just let me clean what we don't need. Okay. So what I did instead, I flattened my file up to the depth path, to the depth folder. So this way I was okay with the depth, and at any point if I don't know all the students, I'm noticing that I made a big mistake with my with the flattening, I can go back to the previous version of the file and quickly get another copy merge version of the file and just correct with a painting in a mask, you know. So it's quite easy to fix. Okay, and from here now I try to keep things organized with my mood folder on top of everything, and my another version of the depths. So now I've been creating another folder called depths, but what I did basically is just to continue to push the depths further than what I did before. But I was kind of okay with this as a base to work with, so this is why I flattened it, and now I have a much smaller file which is more manageable and, you know, easier to make corrections. So once again, paint over and my separator, which is here. So just did a couple change based on the last one. And no, it's not the correct one, it was this one. You know, fixed a bit of the lighting in the clouds. So the clouds, they are just clouds that I painted with a cloud brush. And from now on, once I start with that, generally, as I said, I generally try to keep my mood, at least my mood, in separate folder. Though sometimes I can flatten it, but now I'm less scared to flatten things, because I started to flatten. So I really like this part of the process, because this is really when the compositing is finished. I'm happy, I'm kind of happy with the overall values, colors, and mood, and so on. So now I'm really starting the painting process, which is really make this to work as a painting. So how does you make an image work as a painting? It's mostly by simplifying textures and working on edges. So just lose some edges and, yeah, do what a painter does, you know, just fix very small things there and there that doesn't work, and so on. So this is a bit later, the version 7. So I'm going to save that one too. And what I do from time to time, I like to do this. I like to drop a threshold adjustment layer on top of everything to make sure to have another vision of the values of my painting. And if when I'm using this threshold adjustment, I can't understand my image, it often means that something is wrong with the composition. It doesn't have to be perfect on the understanding, but at least the major elements of the image should read. At an abstract level, I mean, if here I wasn't capable of identifying any shape, it would mean that my composition had an issue. And another thing I like to do is sometimes just do a quick post-processing pass with Camera Raw, and I'll show you later how to do that. Just to have an idea, I don't know if you can see this in the video, but just add tiny bit of light bloom and of grain, of photographic grain, just to have an idea of how it kind of looks like in a finished state, to see, just to see where I am, you know, in a more or less finished conditions. And this one is a bit later in the process. So here you see I still have my layers, and here I added an FX layer on top of everything. And I have my clean path and my paint over. So what mostly changed in here, if I can figure it out, yeah, it's this, sorry for the noise, apologies. Okay, so let's clean everything. Okay, so I have my mood in here. I have my depth correction, so we are more or less in the same stage than here, if I'm removing my FX. Okay. So here I just added a bit more clouds and so on. And now I started the paint over process. So this is my favorite stage. So what I do in the paint over process is I'm just taking a brush, mixer brush or the standard brush, and I'm going through the image and I start to really try to work on my edges and on my textures. So I try to simplify the textures as much as I can. See, just try to lose edges, simplify textures, lose edges, simplify textures. It's a slow process, but it's really enjoyable because at this stage, this is a no-brainer. There is like almost everything is fixed and not everything. The character here and the skin doesn't work at all, but for the paint over parts, a lot of things are already fixed. So this is just a matter of picking colors, painting, picking colors, painting, another paint over layer. So this is before the paint over, after, before, after. These are really slight, very slight changes, but that makes the difference between an image that can look 3D-ish and a bit too sharp, and an image that look more painterly. Paint over. So how do I paint over? So I'm going to show you this here. I'm going to pick my clean layer. Let's pretend we are starting from here. I use two things for my paint over, two Photoshop tools that you all know. The first is the brush tool with my custom brushes. No, pick, paint, just to simplify textures and lose edges and bring that degree of painterliness. And it's a slow process, but as I said, it's very enjoyable because you can put some music and stop solving problems and just enjoying the process of painting. And yeah, I destroyed my file, so no problem. Now, the second way of doing it that I love to use is using the mixer brush. So I'm going to include a lot of these brushes in the tutorial. So the mixer brush, it's kind of a complicated brush at first when you're not used to, but most of the time what I use is a blending feature of the mixer brush. Yeah, very awesome, right? So it's really great because you don't have to pick colors, you just need to brush over your painting. But sometimes it's a bit complicated to not be able to separate the changes you are making on a separate layer, right? Because at some point it's just layer after layer after layer of changes, but you can't really go back and identify the part of the image that are being involved in the changes, apart just clicking to see, but you can't make a selection, for example, and so on. So what you can do, very simple trick, you're going to duplicate your file. You take the fill, this layer, you take the fill of this layer and you put it to 1%, very, very important, okay? 1% fill. Now you create an empty layer that you are going to place underneath this 1% fill layer. And now you're going to merge down this third layer, okay? I'm going back. You merge down your 1% fill layer into your empty layer. So what it does, Then what it does is now you can pick your blender, square blender, and you can remove this sample all layers. And the way the mixer brush works is going to pick the fill part of the layer. So if I'm clicking on this layer, apparently there is nothing, you see. You can tell there is nothing, but actually there is something. There is all the information, see, that are underneath. They are here, right? So you can now come and brush into this layer, and your blending brush is going to pick these fill informations to paint. And this is honestly an awesome feature, really awesome. So now I can just go into this layer and focus on the micro composition. So micro composition is, you know, de-emphasizing edges where they don't need to be emphasized, just to slow down the rhythm of the reading. De-emphasize edges, simplify textures where they don't need to be complex, because it distracts from focusing on the interesting part of the image. You know, concentrate on adding movement in the image. So movement through careful texture brushing, just to help create an impression of displacement. De-emphasize edges if needed. At some part of the image, I mean, it's already obvious that there is a shape separation. So sometimes you don't need to have such a strong edge, because it distracts the eye. It creates too strong of a contrast, and then your eyes tends to want to go where there is this stronger shape or value or line contrast. So by de-emphasizing edges like that, you know, it helps to slow down the rhythm of the reading of the image. Yeah, you know, like for example here there is texture everywhere. It's really not interesting. It's not beautiful, and it's not needed. This texture here is too strong, so carefully brushing over, pick another brush, you know, simplify textures. And add movement in the direction of the center of interest. Starting to brush, suggest movement in the texture itself. It's like having an oil paint with a fresh layer of paint on top of it, and you start to just having fun in blending colors, textures, edges. And sometimes you can be more heavy-handed if you want to suggest, you know, a stronger movement at some place. If a brush doesn't work, you know, just try another one. But for example, here everything is too complex in here, so I'm going to pick like, don't know, this airy brush, and try to simplify all these complex patterns that doesn't bring anything to the story and to the reading. So just want to simplify. also break edges. It can help to, you know, just break some edges because they look too sharp and 3D-ish. Yeah, so this is it. This is how I'm doing it, and depending on the need, sometimes I can pick the normal brush and start just painting with a flat opaque color that I'm picking up. For example, sometimes I'll tell you, okay, this green is cool. You know, I want to add a bit more of this green in here, and maybe de-emphasize it at some other place. So both brush engines are really interesting, because if you only use the mixer brush and you start to be too heavy-handed with it, it starts to, I don't know how to explain that. The image will look like a mushroom. I don't know. It's like everything doesn't have any strength. So it's very important to keep some strong edges and to de-emphasize other edges. It's really a fine balance of where you want to have your details and where you want your audience to look at. And I have some brushes that are more suited to de-emphasize textures, and some others that works better for edges. Depends. And it's only when you go through and you click, you start to realize how better it looks when you start to do this work. And it's a work of patience, because it definitely takes time. I mean, it can take up to a full day for an image like that, for me, to really do this painting over work that is going to fill the gap between a 3D-ish colored work and a painting. And obviously for concept art and so on, I don't spend that much time. I don't need to. I'm going to get rougher. But for cover art and commercials and so on, it's important I think, to really spend time to do this, to really help to make this feel painterly. Well, at least this is what I like. I mean, you don't have to like that, but for me it's important. Finalizing. So this is where we were. So I'm going to Ctrl-A, Ctrl-C, copy paste this so we can see the difference. This is the stage before, this is now. Before, now. You can see nothing much has changed. These are really slight changes, but for me, these changes, they make all the difference. This is really the difference between something that looks 3D-ish and too sharp and not yet a full-fledged illustration, and something that looks painterly and yeah, just finished. So for this, I'm going to go through this file here. So as you can see, when I start to do this paint over work, I'm flattening everything. Almost everything. I mean, I still have my very important layers that I don't want to touch, which are the FX, the mood, and some of the post effects. I'm going to show you this. But for all the rest, I'm flattening. So I have my base. I try to keep an history of my very important states, just in case I need to bring back something from a previous stage. So I believe this is more or less this stage here, as you can see, apart from the FX. This is the same stage. So after this, I have a first stage of paint over. So here I did exactly what I shown you before, which is just moving around the image, simplify textures, and start to lose edges. So here I started to correct the main character, you know, fix some of the skin issues and the shape of the feet. You know, adding some more details and continuing to do this simplification and edge work. So here I decided to add back some straighter lines at some places, add more details. A little fix here. We can almost not see it. Fixing again. This one, I don't even know what it is. It's, yeah, sometimes it's really small fix, you know. Just fixing a bit of the over brightness of this red here. Bit of details. The advantage of this stage is because there is layer with very few pixel content, it doesn't take that much place in memory. I mean, it doesn't create like these huge files I had before. So here again, a little fix on this foot to make it look like more natural. I don't know if it's better, but I think it wasn't very elegant, this very big toe. So I wanted to fix that, you know, small fix on the character again. Here I don't even know what I did. Sometimes I have a layer. So there is something in here, but I don't know why. Let's see. Oh, you can see it's here. Very small fix. Yeah, so this is a fix, I believe, on the end. I cannot see it. I don't know what it is. So same thing here. What I did, it was maybe dissolve. Oh, okay, this is a cool trick. I want to show you this. So the dissolve blend mode, I honestly never managed for a long time to find a decent use for it. And I think like 1 year and a half ago, I found a really cool use. And what I do usually, I make a copy of my image. And I'm using, what's the name again? Gaussian blur. You know, a small Gaussian blur of maybe like 4 pixels, I don't know, 4 or 5 pixels. And then I'm putting this layer on dissolve, right? And when you start to lower the density down, it really does a nice job at breaking edges. Because on surfaces, it doesn't change a lot of things. It's not super obvious. But on edges, it does this interesting job of breaking edges without blurring them too much. Right? And then what I did here is simply go with my round brush and start to slightly de-emphasize some edges. So it's very subtle, but as I said, these are these very small subtle steps. I mean, if I just merge everything to see what I have here, all these small steps, they start to, one after another, do something. Because we'll see afterward what we did. Let me get back to the initial stage to make sure I don't break anything. Okay. Very slight, small modification overall. No, we are not going to spend too much time, but a slight post-processing trick I did here is just to copy merge my image and use and convert. I converted it into what's the name again? Forgot it. Smart object. Right, because what is interesting with smart objects is that you can easily add dynamic filters. So if you're not happy with this Gaussian filter, you can come back here and slightly change the value of the filter. So what I did, I believe, is make a copy merge of my image. I'm going to do it again for you, but basically make a copy merge, change the contrast ratio in order to only get a very contrasty version and information about the lightest part of the image. Add a slight blur on top of everything and putting it on screen and 50% and paint into a mask. So sometimes I do more complicated bloom effects, but for this instance I think it was enough. So copy merge. No, get only the informations. Then convert it to. I could even do that, convert to smart object in the first place. Add blur of maybe like a slight blur of 4%, 4 pixels, I mean. Then contrast the image and now blur it again. Blur. I believe it was like something like 40%. Okay, and now I can put it on screen. And it creates this bloom effect path. And I would advise to be very careful with bloom effect because sometimes moving from no bloom to bloom, it looks like super, I don't know, flattering, but in general, it tends to break composition a lot because it removes the nice separation you've been doing between your shapes. So I think it's something to use with a lot of care, just come by hand and brush at some places to suggest the light bloom, but without having it everywhere. Because you don't need to have it everywhere to suggest to the brain of the viewer that the light is so strong that the brightest part of the image start to scatter, light start to scatter in the either in the eye or in the lens. Because this is what light bloom is. Light bloom is the dispersion of the highest part of the light spectrum that reach either your cornea or either the lens of the camera. And it is so strong that when it starts to enter the camera or the eye, it starts to scatter around the main shape. So it creates this slight bloom effect, which is very nice, but overuse it's really bad. Okay, so light scattering. Small trick, and I did something else here to break the edges. So what I did here, I created an edge map. Very, very interesting to have an edge map for post-processing purposes. So to make an edge map, you go into filter gallery, and you pick this glowing edges filter, right? So you want to adjust this filter so it's not too noisy. So I'm going to increase my edge width and maybe decrease my smoothness. No, increase my smoothness a lot. work with my edge brightness, my edge width. I don't know. It's a slight balance to find. Okay. And we are going to clean this afterward because it's too noisy. Right, so now I'm going to desaturate everything and I'm going to clean this edge map like that. Okay, and now I'm going to blur. I'm going to use a slight Gaussian blur. Doesn't have to be super strong. And the goal is just to be able to create a selection of my edges. So Control A, Control C, and now I have an edge map. So this is what I have in here. And what I did here, I'm trying to figure out because I don't remember. Okay, so I did a slight, I believe this is not, yeah. This is not a Gaussian blur. I think this is a lens blur. Here, blur, lens blur. So this is a slight lens blur that I did on top of everything. And I use this edge map to break a bit more my edges, like that. And on top of it, I've been adding a texture, a painterly texture. Let me show you this texture on overlay mode. It's very subtle. I don't even know if we can see it, but super subtle texture on top of everything to break a bit of this edge blur. Okay, my red pill is here. So this is honestly very subtle, but it starts to matter in the next step I'm going to show you, which is extremely important. Let me save this. And the next stage is the post-processing stage. So a trick in Photoshop to create a dynamic post-processing, because it's really when you start to make a series of post-processing steps, and then all of a sudden you need to change something underneath the stack. It's really annoying because you have to redo these steps by hand all the time. It's terrible. So what you can do, very nice trick, is you take your file here, right? You Control A, Control Maj C to make a copy merge version. Okay, Control in to create a new file from the clipboard, create Control V. Now you are going to click on this file and you are to convert it into a smart object. And now you can reference, if you have one of the later version of Photoshop, otherwise it won't work, but on one of the later version of Photoshop that can cross-reference another file, you can use this rolling to file feature. If it's not possible, what you can do otherwise is you pick your main file, right? With Control Maj A, you select all of your layers and you click on them and you convert them into a smart object. For this to work, you need to have no local layer selected. So you can convert to smart object. I'm not going to do it because there is a lot of layers, but basically it does the exact same thing. The only difference is in this case, let's do it anyway, so you can see what it does. If you convert it into a smart object, you layers into your files, then your smart object is going to be embedded into your file. So this is going to increase quite significantly the size of your file. But it works. What I'm going to show works in this instance, or you can do it the way I'm showing already. You're just creating this new file, and now once you have a smart object, you can running to file. And now when you are running into file, you can select the file in question. Let's say I'm selecting down the rabbit hole detailing. Okay, and you're clicking on place. Okay, and now the nice thing is that every time you are going to update this file, right? Then detailing, anything I do on this file now, if I'm saving it, it's going to update this one. So let's say, for example, I'm doing something super interesting like this, you know, and if I'm doing Control S, it's going to save the file. Sorry for the time it takes. And then it's going to update this one. Okay. And now you can see it's updating the smart object. Right? So, let's get back to where I was. I'm going to close this one. Now I showed you how I do it. Remove this layer. Okay. And now I'm going to save this one in the proper folder, and I'm going to relink to file, and I'm going to pick down the rabbit hole 10 detailing. So it's going to create the link, and it's going to update the post-processing effect. So for this file, my post-processing stack is super simple. So let's save this one. So it's going to update in this one. There is only one camera raw effect, which is here. But sometimes it really depends on the file. So there is no receipt. But I'm going to show you the step I take. Sometimes I have more effects that are added in the post-processing stage. So let's open this just to see what I have. So I have basically a sharpening with luminance and a bit of grain. Okay, so now let's pretend I want to separate my grain from my sharpening luminance. So what I did, I just copy dragged with Ctrl-Alt drag this effect to duplicate it. So I'm going to remove the grain from this one. Amount of grain 0. Okay. And on this stage, I'm going to remove the sharpening luminance. And really this post-processing thing is super important because sometimes it really makes a difference before you're exporting your image into GPG, between you know, just a whip and a final image. So I don't want any sharpening here, and I don't want any luminance. I only want the noise. Right? So now I have two effects, one with the noise and one with the sharpening and luminance. Now if I'm, just unclicking this layer, you can see it doesn't, it's not a lot, but it does change a few things. I think there is another adjustment somewhere. Yeah, this is the exposure. So I only want to keep the exposure on one of these layers. Okay. So now it means that I can continue to add very, very small adjustments on this dynamic layer. And now each time I'm going to make a modification in here, continue to paint over and just do like small modification at some places. Each time I'm going to save this file, it's going to update the post-processing version. And if I don't want it to happen, I can simply close this one, save it, close it, and it won't update. And it will only update next time I'm going to open it. It's going to ask me if I want to update it. So it's a really nice way to have all of the post-processing effect into one place and not having to update them by hand. So about Camera Raw, let's open Camera Raw, and it's really an amazing tool. I mean, if you are doing a bit of photography, you probably know Camera Raw, and if you don't, you should really, because for post-image processing, it's really an incredible tool, very powerful. I mean, you can pretty much really tweak anything you want from, just tweak a bit the contrast and lowering your black, I don't know. A thing I try to be very careful for my images is to make sure that I don't have too much values either in the higher end of the spectrum or in the lower end, because for images that are meant to be displayed on screens, you have to be careful about the screens that tends to crush values in the extreme of the spectrum. I mean, most of the screen do it. Even the high-end screens like iPhone screens and iPad screens, they don't have a perfectly linear answer. I mean, if you take an ISO as reference, you really are going to see the difference on this screen. So the best things to do is just to avoid to have too much values in the very dark and the very bright. This way you are going to make sure that your image is going to display okay on most screens. So yeah, Camera Raw, you can basically tweak your color temperature, fix just very, very small things if you need to. Add a bit of grain. Luminance is very interesting to just remove a bit of the noise in some big flat areas. You can sharpen. You can obviously sharpen in Photoshop, but I really like the sharpening algorithm in Camera Raw, because you have this masking, dynamic masking, and you can add more details if you want. And you can tweak pretty much any color and value you want. You can even do a bit of lens correction if you want. I generally try to avoid as much as possible to do vignetting. I was using it at some point, but I started to realize it really makes the image look cheap. But sometimes just a small amount of vignetting can be cool. And the grain in Camera Raw, I really like the grain, so I try to use this one in general. And you can sometimes you can have interesting effect by starting to tweak just part of the of the primary colors. It's not something I would advise to do at the very end of a process like that, where you spend so much time to make sure that your colors were working together. But sometimes in visual development where you want to work faster, it can be an interesting thing to discover unexpected color schemes and come with like different color gamuts, gamut mask, sorry. Okay, I'm going to cancel this, but this is camera raw. So I believe this is it, the last step I'm taking, and this is for exporting JPG. I'm adding very slight amounts of noise on top of everything. You really have to zoom in way in to see it. But what I found with time is that it helps the JPG export algorithm to get a more interesting grain and avoid some of the artifacts that come with the residual existence of 3D. So sometimes, just find it looks better. So this is like noise, add noise. I'm using it only for this, so this is my usual setting, 3.5% of noise. And I'm putting this into overlay like 30-50%, it depends. A quick overall review of the process before finishing. So start in 3D with very simple shapes, define composition, then start to add more details once the composition is more or less defined. Focus on the keyshot windows to really start to see it as the beginning of the painting instead of just a 3D render. Just starting to texture underneath the light path, adding atmospheric perspective, starting to get crazy with colors, and start to define a more coherent color schemes and separate elements by painting. Work on atmosphere, even more fix, and painting over, start to blend edges and simplify textures and surfaces. More paint over, and I think final tweaks, just more edge blending and just a bit of post-processing to push it to a finished state. So thank you for watching, and don't hesitate to reach me if you have any question or have a feedback you want to let me know of. You can reach me by emails, social media, whatever. Just get in touch and I'll do my best to come back to you as soon as I can. Bye.